Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. I'm Tom, and this video is discussing a couple of arguments for the existence of God. The first one is what's known as the cosmological argument for God's existence, and the second one is known as Pascal's wager, right? So we will talk about the cosmological argument first. The reading for this is a reading by William Craig, who's writing about the Kalam cosmological argument. This argument, Craig is writing in the 20th century, but he's pulling from some writings in the medieval period. There are lots of thinkers that gave some version of the cosmological argument. When he mentions the Kalam cosmological argument, he's drawing from Islamic theologians, right? So in particular, he's talking about Al-Ghazali. There are a number of well-known Islamic philosophers, Avicenna, Averroes, Al-Ghazali being among them. And he takes a version of his, right? A lot of this actually comes from Aristotle. All the thinkers in the medieval period were very interested in Aristotle. So it's no surprise, right? And one idea from Aristotle that this kind of comes from is the idea of a prime mover, right? A cause of everything that is itself not caused by anything. So the basic idea is one that we should be familiar with, right? It has to do with causality. We've been talking about this in determinism, right? In determinism, we talked about efficient causality, the kind of causal chain, cause and effect type of deal that we are very familiar with in the natural sciences. Now, one question that gets that kind of comes up when you think about every action as being, or every event as being determined by some previous event, right, is, well, if event A was caused originally by event B, then that means that event B must have been caused by something before it, event C, and so on and so forth. And then the question arises, well, what was the first cause, right? What caused everything, right? And the idea in the cosmological argument is that there must be some cause that caused everything. And that cause would be something that caused everything, but was not caused by something else, right? It has to end that causal chain. And the idea is that that is God, right? And there are a few features of this kind of medieval conception of God that are really important to understanding why this is supposed to work, right? God is, has all the omni kind of features, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, or loving, omniscient, knowing, these kinds of things. But also, God is thought of as the creator of everything, right? And also, God is thought to have necessary existence. What does that mean? Well, here necessary existence can be contrasted with contingent existence, right? So I have contingent existence. I wouldn't be here if my parents didn't meet, right? This computer in front of me has contingent existence because it wouldn't be here if someone didn't make it, right? This video has a contingent existence because it wouldn't be here unless I recorded it, right? Everything's existence is kind of contingent on something else bringing it about, right? However, God's existence is not supposed to be contingent on anything, right? God has necessary existence, so God's existence is not contingent on anything else. God didn't need anything to kind of be in place for God to exist, right? This goes hand in hand with the idea that God's a creator, in the sense that God was not created by anything else, because God's existence can't be contingent on something else. And so anything that exists must be the product, right, of God's creation, right? So these are kind of like basic kind of medieval conception of God in like the Abrahamic traditions, monotheistic Western traditions, right? And so the idea is that if anything was the creator of everything and wasn't created by something else, then that thing's got to be God, right? God's the only thing that like fits the bill, right? So that's the basic idea behind the cosmological argument. Now, if you look at Craig's reading here, it says the kind of basic argument that he gives, which is really nicely formatted for us, says first premise is that whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. This makes very good sense, right? If you see something, an event or an object, there was something that started that thing going, put it in motion, right? Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning. The universe began to exist just like anything else. Therefore, the universe has a cause of its beginning, right? And the only thing that could be that cause would have to be God, right? And so the argument itself is very simple, but he spends a lot of time discussing how you support these premises, right? So if the premises are true, then it seems like the conclusion is going to follow. But there's a question about whether or not the premises are true, right? And so the first one is one he probably spends the most time on. Whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning, right? And he sharpens this up a little bit, but I'm not going to really talk about that. That one dash where he says, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause of its beginning. But he considers some things to support that idea. And one is that something cannot come from nothing, right? And he gives the example, nobody sincerely believes that things like, say, a horse or an Eskimo village can just pop into being without a cause. In general, we tend to think that that's right. But of course, there's a concern that, the universe is not just anything, right? So a horse and the universe are very different things. And when we're talking about like the difference between, say, the birth of a baby calf, right? And the Big Bang, right? We tend to think these are fundamentally different kinds of things. So you might be suspicious of that first kind of support. The second thing is, he says, if something can come into being from nothing, then it becomes inexplicable why just anything or everything doesn't come into being from nothing, right? That's also a questionable premise, right? Or questionable support for his premise. Ultimately, at the end of the day, right, there is a question about the plausibility, or well, let me put it this way, the metaphysical commitments around this argument, right? So on the one hand, it seems like with the Kalam argument, the cosmological argument, we have kind of two options. One is to say that the universe began from nothing, which seems like, as he mentions, inexplicable, right? Doesn't really give us much of an explanation. Or we can say that the universe began from God, and how God created the universe is yet again inexplicable, right? How do we get the universe out of nothing? Or how do we get the universe out of God and then don't know, and God wasn't caused by anything else, right? So it seems like you got two kind of not great options, right? It's really difficult to understand how God is supposed to create everything. It's also difficult to understand how everything just kind of popped into existence. However, the idea that everything popped into existence is at least more metaphysically conservative than the idea that God created everything, right? At least that's one way you can go, right? But either way, it's a difficult question to answer. And Craig has some interesting ideas about it. He seems to think this is a really great argument, but it is a very classic argument, and it's a good one to know, and it fits in with what we've talked about with determinism. Now, The second part of this video is discussing Pascal's wager. Now, Pascal provides a good segue to our next unit, which is on epistemology, or the theory of knowledge. The Kalam argument, cosmological argument, is really dealing with metaphysics, as we've been dealing with the existence of free will, here the existence of God, the nature of reality, these kinds of things. Pascal asks a very different question with Pascal's wager. Instead of asking whether or not God exists, he asks whether or not it's a better bet to believe in God than not to. And the way he kind of breaks this down is very simple, right? He thinks about, and he's working within the kind of Western Christian paradigm. And he says, well, you kind of have two options. You can believe in God or you can not believe in God. And he says, well, if you believe in God, what are kind of your possible outcomes in terms of God existing or God not existing? And so he thinks, well, if you believe in God and God does exist, that means that when you die, presumably you go to heaven and you get eternal happiness, right? But if you believe in God and you die and there is no God, then nothing happens, right? There's no afterlife. Alternatively, if you don't believe in God and when you die, God exists, then you presumably go to hell, right, for your lack of faith, right? And then you get eternal pain and suffering, right? But if you are an atheist and you die and you're right, right, you don't get to celebrate with your atheist friends and say, ha, I knew I was right. Nothing happens, right? Same thing as if you did believe in God. And so he basically looks at this wager and he thinks, well, if you do believe in God, you stand to gain everything and lose nothing. And if you don't believe in God, you stand to lose everything and gain nothing. And so it's a very simple kind of answer for him, which is the idea that believing in God is a better bet, right? So this is kind of like a pragmatic turn on this question. There are lots of questions about how this is framed up, right? He's using this very Christian paradigm. Even within the Christian paradigm, there's questions about limbo, purgatory, what it means to believe in God, how that looks in your day-to-day life. And, if you're not using a Christian paradigm, you can think about reincarnation, you can think about nirvana in the Buddhist sense, all kinds of other options, right? But nonetheless, the point still stands. And what's interesting about it, I think, is the idea about thinking about what's at stake when you believe in God or don't believe in God. And that's just a different way to think about this question rather than from a purely metaphysical stance. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll be talking soon. Thank you.